Will Jeff McNeil play out his entire contract with the New York Mets, or will they trade him before it's over? We're going to talk about that on today's show.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Since today is the non-tender deadline, which we will talk about in the final segment, I thought it would be the perfect time to talk about a player that I think a lot of Mets fans would be ready for the team to just cut bait on, and that's Jeff McNeil. Jeff McNeil coming off a pair of bad seasons and now under a contract that looks super bloated. But let's go back to the beginning with Jeff McNeil, because the crazy part about this contract is it was signed for 2025. What do I mean by that? Jeff McNeil would be a free agent right now had the Mets never given him that extension. The reason they signed him to that deal was to buy out his first 2 years of free agency, which would have started right now. Why were they so motivated to do that? Well, Jeff McNeil was an all-star in 2022. He won a batting title. He hit 326, got on base at a 382 clip, slugged at a 454 clip. We talk about weighted runs created plus a lot on this show. It's an all-encompassing stat that measures hitters on a league average of 100. He had a 140 WRC plus, which is very good, 40 points better than league average. And he was worth 5.6 wins above replacement, according to FanGraphs. If you kind of understand the scale of WAR, a 2-win player is a really solid bench player. A 4-win player is a solid starter. Anything above that, 5 wins and beyond, you're talking about an all-star. Jeff McNeil was great in 2022. That was his second all-star season. If you look at his career up to that point, 2018 through 2022, he was a career 307 hitter with a 370 on-base percentage. When it comes to OPS, he was ranked in the top 30 in Major League Baseball. His WRC plus also in the top 30 in Major League Baseball across that, 2018-19, 2021-22. So that 5-year span, he was a top 30 hitter in the game, a 2-time All-Star. He was set to play the World Baseball Classic as part of Team USA, was potentially going to start in that World Baseball Classic, coming off the great season. Overall, he was a really good player. But in retrospect, the 2021 season was a red flag the Mets chose to ignore. And that was a season where Jeff McNeil hit 251. But they didn't look at that. They focused more on the 2022 career year. Thought, you know what? Let's buy out his arbitration, first 2 years of free agency, and keep Jeff McNeil in a Mets uniform at a reasonable salary. And by doing that, they flattened out his contract. So they took those arbitration numbers into account with the free agent numbers so that his luxury tax hit once he hit free agency as a team that's always going to be in the tax was a little bit less. So Jeff McNeil, he only counts as $12.5 million on the tax, but now he's going to start to get paid $15.75 million. And the way the contract was broken up, it pretty much stayed in line with what he was going to make in arbitration. He was set to make a little over $6.5 million. Instead, he made $6.25 million in 2023. 2024, if he had a good year, he would have gotten a bump over $10 million. Now, in retrospect, he didn't play well in 2023, so he might not have gotten that bump through arbitration, but he would have gotten a bump all the same. He ends up making $10.25 million this past year, and then now you get to the free agent years where the Mets were projecting Jeff McNeil to hit the market probably after another all-star season at some point, maybe a couple more years batting over 300. They thought he would have hit the market and easily been able to reach that $15 million in salary and maybe over a 4-year deal. So it was a genius deal. You sign him at the time, you lock him up, You have a club option on the deal for an additional season into his free agency years for 2027 at $15.75 million. It made sense. Unfortunately, Jeff McNeil has not played well enough where that contract has been worth it. And now you look at it and you think, man, if Jeff McNeil was just off the books, the Mets would be free to re-sign Jose Iglesias at a number that's still less than that $15.75 million, and they'd be better off. But you can't go back in time. You're locked into this deal. And I think if you're sort of forecasting what the Mets are going to do to eat down that contract to a suitable number, and I think they'd probably have to eat about half of it to make him attractive to other teams, all of a sudden, is that really worth it? Is it worth it to, spend maybe it's $16 million over the next 2 years on Jeff McNeil to play for another team, and then to also sign Jose Iglesias, right? Let's just say you sign Jose Iglesias to a 2-year, I don't know, maybe it's a $15 million deal. I don't know. He should have a pretty decent market coming off the season that he just had, which is why I think he might price himself out of coming back to the Mets, even though he's doing radio interviews this week talking about the Mets as a we. Someone who's part of it saying he'd be surprised if he's not back. So that's a whole nother conversation for another day on this show. But the point is, if the Mets were to eat down this contract and then they sign Iglesias, and then Iglesias, who's in his mid-30s, falls off a cliff, well, now you're paying two guys. And I think they literally just did that with James McCann and Omar Narvaez. They ate down James McCann's contract to get him off the books, and then they signed another bad deal on a veteran catcher and Omar Narvaez, and eventually had to cut bait there. So I think because of that, it doesn't necessarily make sense to eat down the contract, at least right now. But you also have the silver lining, which was the second half that Jeff McNeil had. I think that's what the Mets are going to be clinging on to right now. In the second half, after the All-Star break, Jeff McNeil hit 289, 376 on base, 547 slug, which was ridiculous. Had 7 home runs and 12 doubles in 41 games. 19 extra base hits in 41 games is a lot. And across that span, he ranked 20th in Major League Baseball in OPS at 923. So can the Mets get that version of Jeff McNeil or something a little bit less than that in 2025? Is there any hope that he's bouncing back? What's his role going to be next season? And is there a point in time where they would consider trading Jeff McNeil? We're going to talk about the next 2 years with Jeff McNeil in just a minute. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time. It's a fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. Let's say you want to go to a Knicks game over the weekend. I'm actually not sure if they're in town, or you just want to get out of the house, right? You pull open the Game Time app. You look at live nearby. You can find what's going on near you, whether that's a comedian that's in town, whether that's going to see a Broadway show, or if it is going to an NBA game or an NHL game. You can find all of that over on Game Time. And Game Time has Game Time Picks, which is a feature on the app that'll filter out the fluff and show you only the best possible deals on great seats. So you don't have to waste your time searching through thousands of tickets. When you download the Game Time app, you can create an account and use the code LOCKEDONMLB. You're going to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. Stay up to date with all the latest in the world of sports when you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube today, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Our next goal is to get to 11,000 subscribers. We're almost 100 away. I appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. All right, so let's talk about the next couple years with Jeff McNeil. Again, he's set to make $15.75 million over these next 2 seasons. So altogether in salary, he's going to make $31.5 million. There's a $2 million buyout on that club option in 2027 that the Mets are almost definitely going to exercise unless Jeff McNeil just has an incredible renaissance over the next 2 years. So altogether, he's owed $33.5 million of that $50 million deal that he signed. He also has a little trade kicker. So if the Mets trade him, he gets a $500,000 bonus, has incentives in his contract. If he wins World Series MVP, gets 100K, 50K apiece for LCS MVP, Gold Glove, Silver Slugger, or an All-Star appearance. Contract aside, and I think that's the way the Mets have to view Jeff McNeil at this point. He's still a valuable piece of this roster because of that positional flexibility. That matters. There are not a lot of players in Major League Baseball that are above average in the dirt and in the grass. There's just not a lot, and that's playing infield and outfield. There's guys that can do it all, that can play in both spots, but play each position at a league average level. A very few. In this past season, he ranked just above league average at second base, just above league average in right field, and just barely below league average in left. Altogether, when we look at his defensive value, he was about league average. And to get league average production in 3 spots, that is of value for a guy that does have an offensive gear that he can get to. We've seen it the last 2 seasons down the stretch. In 2023, he did come on down the stretch to get his batting average up to 270, but you could say, man, a lot of those hits came when the Mets were out of it. 2024, he played well when the Mets were in a pennant race, right? They were trying to make the playoffs, and Jeff McNeil in the second half was the second best hitter in that lineup for a 40-game sample behind Francisco Lindor. That's how good he was once you got past the All-Star break. But it's hard to ignore the first half of the season, which was a larger sample size, which dragged down his numbers, and then you're clawing yourself out of this hole that you dug for yourself. And at the end of the year, you look at the stats, was not a good year at all. You can talk about a 923 OPS all you want. You can't ignore those, whatever it was, 80 games where he struggled just for the 41 games where he was really good. But going into next year, right now, what is Jeff McNeil's role in the New York Mets? He's their starting second baseman again. Now, if Luisangel Acuña looks amazing in spring training, yeah, he has a chance to edge Jeff McNeil for playing time. If Ronnie Mauricio, same thing, comes into spring, tears the cover off the ball, he might angle for some playing time. But currently, as the roster's constructed, Jeff McNeil is the incumbent. I think he's going to be the starting second baseman. Again, Jose Iglesias is a whole other conversation that we'll probably have on this show at some point coming up soon here, because on the surface, you say, all right, we'll bring him back. But the Mets have so much depth in their farm system at second base right now between Acuña. I think proved at the end of last year, while some people I think are probably overvaluing him, thinking he is definitely the second baseman in the future. I'm not quite there, because I'm not going to ignore a much larger sample size of what he did in AAA in favor of one amazing week in the big leagues. And it was an amazing week when he filled in for Lindor, but there's still questions there. With that said, should Luisangel Acuña be in AAA again next season? I don't think so, because his ability to, just like Jeff McNeil actually, play in the dirt and the grass, to be a center fielder if the Mets need him to, as well as a second baseman, that to me, as well as also your backup shortstop, mind you, that is too valuable, I think, to stash him in AAA. I want to see what he can do on a big league roster, because I think if nothing else, Luisangel Acuña is going to be an excellent bench piece for a long time in the big leagues at worst. At best, he's your starting second baseman. And I think because of Acuña's presence and Jeff McNeil as well, that's where I wonder if Jose Iglesias comes back, because why pay Jose Iglesias whatever it ends up being? I think there might be some bidding for him, over $5 million, potentially a multi-year deal, when you have Acuña on the minimum that can do a lot of the same things defensively. And yes, Iglesias as a culture setter, as a leader, that's value that you can't really compute. And maybe it's enough to bring him back. But if they do, you got a kind of cluttered roster that might not have room for Acuña at the start of the season, or Mauricio as well. So you have to weigh those things. Because they have Acuña, Mauricio, Jet Williams as well waiting in the wings, second base is a bit loaded. And at some point across the next 2 years, I would hope that one of those young guys does knock McNeil off the position and push Jeff into a bench utility role, where he is still very suited to be a valued piece of the Mets in more limited playing time, where you can stick him out in right field when you need him to. If somebody goes down, Jeff McNeil is the injury replacement that can fill in left, in right, at second, at third if you needed him to, or of course, whoever your second baseman is, let's say it's a Ronnie Mauricio, you could slide that person over to third if you needed to and have McNeil fill in at second. So his value with the glove is still good enough where I don't think he's a wasted roster spot. If Jeff McNeil was a second baseman only and not a good one, yeah, you'd be really feeling the weight of that contract. At least he's going to provide some value in being able to move around. But when you think about Jose Iglesias and what he meant to the Mets, again, if you could wash away the contract and you make Jeff McNeil a free agent right now, which of those two guys would the Mets be more motivated to bring back? I think it'd be Jose Iglesias. Because McNeil is under this deal, I just don't know if that happens unless they trade him. And if you trade him again, you could run into that situation where you're eating money on his deal. You're signing Jose Iglesias to a contract potentially that doesn't necessarily age well. The only way I'd be cool with that is if Jose Iglesias was signed on a 1-year deal. So you hedge yourself on the risk, because at the end of the day, if you look at career numbers, Jeff McNeil to Jose Iglesias, it's actually not close. Jeff McNeil has been a much better player across their respective careers, particularly, the fact that Iglesias has been around longer. If you narrow his career to the years that Jeff McNeil's been in the big leagues, it's not even close. But this past year, Iglesias was better. If the Mets don't sign Juan Soto and their offseason ends up being a re-signing of Pete Alonso, and then maybe it's bringing back Jesse Winker or Jose Iglesias, but it's really just spending a ton on pitching, Jeff McNeil, I think, becomes even more valuable, because if they don't sign Soto, you're going to have a right field situation that's a lot more in flux, where Starling Marte, again, is probably your opening day right fielder, but Jeff McNeil can slide out there. You can push Starling Marte to DH. I think Jeff McNeil is actually a better right fielder than Starling Marte at this stage. So, again, McNeil provides value with his versatility. As a functional piece of your roster, it's not bad to have him. When you look at the contract, when you think about alternative options that you might want to explore, it does jam you up a little bit. But again, when you get into, the middle of April and Starling Marte gets hurt again, and, potentially the Mets don't have a Juan Soto, whatever it is, and they're counting on Marte in the outfield, it's always nice that you can slide Jeff McNeil into right. Luisangel Acuña all of a sudden is getting run at second base, and you don't have that massive fall off. It's not a good contract. If the Mets could go back in time and wash it away, they would. Do I think Jeff McNeil is a guy that you just cut? Absolutely not. Do I think that Jeff McNeil is a guy that you swallow the contract and trade him if you're not getting anything valuable in return? I also don't think that that is a worthwhile move for the Mets. Now, let's just say you're taking on more money from another team on a player that you want, and part of that deal is you're getting off a bad contract, so you're trading money to bring some money in. Then I can start to get my head around it. I just don't think that trade's going to be there right now. If Jeff McNeil is traded, I think it's after this season, or it's at this year's deadline, where the contract is less, you've paid more of it, and that might be a time where you can pay it down and flip it, particularly after this year, going into 2026, where it's 1 year left on the deal. And if Jeff McNeil has a good season, all of a sudden you could eat down that contract to the point that it's maybe even a little bit valuable on the trade market for the right team that likes Jeff McNeil. And I'm sure he would go to that team and be an all-star again and win a batting title, because that's how these things work for the New York Mets. But overall, if I had to put my money on it, do I think Jeff McNeil plays out the entirety of his contract with the New York Mets? I'm not talking about the club option getting picked up. I think that's as good as off the table for him. I really do. I just can't see a world where that's get picked up. But will Jeff McNeil finish 2026 on the New York Mets Major League roster? My guess would be yes, he will. We'll see if that happens. Final segment today, we're going to talk about the non-tender deadline, a couple of minor league signs the Mets made as well. So we'll go through some just general news in the final segment. First, though, another quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 Get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So you get a hunch in the middle of the game. You can check out the latest stats, you live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. So make sure you got a bet in mind that you know you're going to win. You place that first $5 bet, you cash that. You're also going to get $150 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sports book. If you're an everyday listener to the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service where you get updates from me anytime news breaks on the Mets. So today, when a couple of minor league signings were announced, Joey Meneses and Hobie Harris, first place I went was over to Subtext to let the Locked On Mets insiders know. If you want to be part of our texting service, just find a link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. So is there anything to make of these minor league signings? Joey Meneses is the bigger name, but I wouldn't really look into it too much. 2022, as a rookie for the Nationals, he put up a .930 OPS, 13 home runs in 56 games. I believe he was a 30-year-old rookie at the time, but really good numbers. OPS dropped off to .722 in 2023. Still about league average across 154 games, but it dropped even further in 2024, an OPS of .593. That's why the Nationals cut bait. That's why he was available. Mets signed him to a minor league deal. Not a bad depth option at first base. Do I expect Joey Meneses to get a lot of run in a Mets uniform? I do not, but it is an interesting name in spring training. Kind of similar to last year when they brought in a G-Man Choi. It's a guy you've heard of, but I don't think we'll see much of him. Hobie Harris is actually a much more interesting name here. He also was with the Nationals in 2023, made his debut there. 2024, he pitched exclusively in the minor leagues with the Twins, had an ERA over 6. So you're wondering, why is that more notable? Well, he's got an absolutely nasty splitter, a really good cutter as well. What he struggles with is his four-seam fastball, which got crushed. But you could see a pitch mix there where the Mets have him abandon his fastball, or if they do have him throw a fastball, maybe they give him a sinker grip, have it be more of a two-seam instead of a four-seam that's getting crushed. But I imagine the thought process in this minor league signing is he's got two really good pitches. Let's get him into our lab. Let's work with him. And maybe you might produce a really good reliever. So it's one of those signings that we talk about now briefly. Who knows? It could turn into something. It could not. The Mets have done this with a couple of guys so far this spring. Dylan Covey and Justin Hageman both got split contracts. At least I know Hageman did. I'm pretty sure Covey did as well. So these are guys that if they're on the big league roster, there's a certain salary. Otherwise, they can be optioned down. They also picked up Kevin Herget off of waivers, which leads us into the non-roster deadline today. Those are all players that on the surface, based on stats, I would say could get non-tendered. But they've all been picked up this offseason, as has Luis de los Santos, an infielder. Overall, what you're looking for at the non-tender deadline, guys who are typically nearing their end of arbitration, who are going to make more than the minimum, that don't have a function on your roster. And the Mets did their work early this year when it comes to the non-tender deadline. At the end of the season, they outrighted DJ Stewart and Joey Lucchesi to AAA. Those guys, based on where they're at in their careers, that had the opportunity to elect free agency, both of them did. That was sort of the Mets pseudo non-tenders right there. Those would have been the guys we're talking about. And last year, we had more conversation around the non-tender deadline because DJ Stewart was a big question mark. Are they going to tender him? Are they not going to tender him? There was the big surprise factor when they non-tendered Louis Guillorme. I don't know if there's going to be any shocker this year. The one that jumped out to me, if any, is Paul Blackburn. If the Mets are really wary of his health and are looking at him as a back-end starter that's not worth the $6 million he's going to make in arbitration, there is an off chance they non-tender him to save that money, spend it elsewhere. But I look at $6 million for Paul Blackburn and I say, in free agency, are you really going to find anything better? Paul Blackburn looked very good in the limited sample size we saw of him in a Mets uniform. I think they're going to keep him. It's just the one name where the salary through arbitration was enough that would be even worth non-tendering. Another one, Alex Young, if you go to Spot Track, he's projected to make $1.2 million, and that's a little more than the minimum. The Mets can't afford that $400K to keep him on the 40-man roster. Not necessarily. And you could always cut ties with guys, beyond this. You could always try to pass somebody through waivers. I don't know if there is anyone else that would cut. Alex Young, I mean, in some respects, jumped out. Maybe a Grant Hartwig, Sean Reed Foley. I mean, some of these names of pitchers, like there is a chance. Huascar Brazaban. I really think they're probably going to keep everybody for now. And, if they end up having to cut some of these guys later, they cut them later after having tendered them a contract. I don't think it's that big of a deal when you're talking about, for the most part, guys that are on the minimum. Jose Zokar, if I had to predict a non-tender, maybe it's him, just because he was picked up at the end of last season as a guy that I think for the most part was picked up for potential base running. An outfielder, maybe he gets non-tendered, but there's just not a lot of interesting conversation here at the non-tender deadline. We'll touch on it probably on the next show if there's a notable name, but it might just be something that it's not even worth talking about because the Mets could just non-tender nobody. They're at 34 when it comes to their 40-man roster right now, the last time that I checked. So you still have room right now to sign 6 free agents. The Rule 5 draft deadline to protect players already passed, so there's not going to be any prospects that they're adding to the roster until potentially opening day if one of them breaks camp. Otherwise, you're seeing who passes through the Rule 5, and if everybody does, it's just sort of status quo with your prospects. So not a lot to discuss here with this non-tender deadline. We will have more to talk about as far as what other teams do at the non-tender deadline, and if some really interesting names break free, maybe I'll do a little bit of a brief Saturday show on some names that just hit the market and any interesting stuff that break from the Mets. There's also a chance that we see a trade, right? Because there's teams that have a guy potentially that's, heading towards their final year of arbitration. A good example, Mike Yastrzemski for the Giants, who I think he's projected to make like $9 million. They might not want to pay him. Now, the Mets are in the market for a different outfielder. I don't think that he really fits the Mets' needs. But just in general, there might be a team, let's just say the Pirates, say, you know what, we love Mike Yastrzemski. That's better than we're going to do in free agency. We're not going to be players on the open market. They might swing a trade for a guy like Yastrzemski, where the Giants get a contract off of their books without having to non-tender him. They might get some type of a lottery ticket prospect in exchange or some cash, and a deal can get made. So some of those things could happen, and maybe there's a reliever or a starter that the Mets trade for on Friday. So there is a chance we get some news, but I think for the most part, it's probably going to be a quiet day for the New York Mets. Last piece of news. Francisco Lindor did not win the MVP. Shocker. Not really. Ohtani was unanimous. Lindor did not get a single first place vote, which, again, really not that surprising. When I was making the case for Francisco Lindor to be the MVP, it was at the end of August going into September. Shohei Ohtani had a little bit of a lackluster August, and I believed that Lindor had played him to about a dead heat. And I felt like Lindor deserved the opportunity to earn the MVP in the final month of the season. And you know what? I'll even own that I think Shohei Ohtani earned it when it's all said and done. As much as I am biased, and I think there's an argument about a DH only winning it and the value that Lindor brought to the Mets. And if you just look at the entirety of the season, you add in the postseason as well, then I think Lindor was clearly the most valuable player in the National League. I don't think there was anybody else that affected winning more than Francisco Lindor. But what Shohei Ohtani did to add an exclamation point to his MVP case, it makes sense that he's unanimous. Lindor's back injury didn't help either. He lost some really valuable games at the end of the year that he could have, made a little bit more of a case. But even if he didn't hurt his back and was Superman for those last 2 weeks, he still probably wouldn't have caught Ohtani, especially when there's just so much national media attention that goes on him. I really wanted to see Lindor do it, but second place is not bad. Gets 23 second place votes, 7 third place votes. Everybody had him somewhere in their top 3 on the ballot. and that is a testament to how good Francisco Lindor was in 2024. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As I mentioned, we got some news. If there's something that is juicy to chew on, I might give you a Saturday show. Otherwise, I'll be back on Monday as we continue to go Monday through Friday throughout the offseason. I appreciate all of you for tuning in today. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Help us get to 11,000 subscribers. If you want to follow me on social media, you can do so at Finkelstein Ryan. You can follow the show at Locked On Mets. If you're going to be Locked On Mets Insider, find the link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen or your first watch every day, not for your second watch. Head over to YouTube and check out first ever 24/7 streaming channel that covers everything in the world of sports. We're talking about Locked On Sports today with our local hosts from each team, league-wide hosts from each league. Find Locked On Sports today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube.